The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, senior writer at The Spin-off. Next week, we'll be counting down the top 100 New Zealand television shows of the 21st century. But to celebrate the shows that were disqualified, forgotten, or just too weird, join me, Kura Forrester, Rhiannon McCall, and fellow Spin-off writers live on stage at Q Theatre on October 31st. Prepare for a night of hot takes and cursed clips as we unearth television treasures and argue for their place in our history books. Tickets are on sale now at thespinoff.co.nz/events.
Nau mai hoki mai ki other fold e mihi ne ko Duncan Grieve tōku ingoa. Joined again today for the regular Tuesday episode by Glenn Kine. Kia ora, Glenn.
Morena, Duncan.
We're going to do a bit of a deep dive today on where to for TVNZ. Obviously, as we were recording last week, we sort of nodded at the idea that there was some big news coming out of TVNZ, so it proved the sort of headline of it was that there's a proposal to disestablish the onenews.co.nz service and website, basically fold that into TVNZ Plus. But the scale of that announcement, which we will talk about, sort of masked some other news along the way, but particularly it ultimately opens up some quite existential questions about the future of TVNZ, what TVNZ is for, how it should navigate the next few years, the changing kind of commercial audience, technology drivers of that. So, and Glenn is obviously, with his background, incredibly well placed to discuss all that. So, yeah, Glenn, do you want to start us off? I mean, what did you make of the announcement and of those sort of second tier pieces that actually are quite material?
Yeah, first of all, heart goes out to those, being impacted by this, having, been through this myself. I know how, difficult a time it can be for everyone. So we need to acknowledge that, I think, at the top. Secondly, really good to see some strategic thought in some of the announcements and the future of TVNZ. So I was pleased to see that.
Anything in particular that sort of leapt out from that strategic perspective?
Yeah, I think the move into TV, the very bold actions, I guess, of moving into the future of TVNZ Plus, I think, is absolutely the right direction. There are some rabbit holes that we'll jump down in this pod, I think, that we haven't heard about that I think become very important as part of that strategy. It also, the announcement struck me as being very consultant heavy and Accenture heavy, and I think that's the consultants that have been used obviously to support TVNZ through this. And as a result of that, there were some things that I felt were not necessarily in the language of media speak or the way we might articulate things historically. It felt a bit more consultancy talk than perhaps otherwise I've seen before.
So one of the things which got buried a bit was this idea of news, rather than being a sort of separate division unto itself, being that it would be folded into and report into content. And on some level you can understand that. Ultimately these are units of entertainment. These are units of content, and they have different manufacturing processes and drivers and functions in society. But ultimately, your business model, as of right now, is the same. It goes on a screen. You sell ads against it. Ideally, you sell the ads for more than it costs to manufacture the thing. But the idea that news would be treated like another piece of content, and that the sort of the way that it is understood within the organisation is ultimately on the same basis that a comedy, a drama, a piece of commercially funded content that caused a lot of disquiet amongst news people. I know. What is your sort of take on whether that will ultimately fly?
Yeah, it's not necessarily something I think is going to be easy to execute at all. There is a huge need from within the newsroom to maintain editorial independence and decision making around how that product appears on screen. Decisions around live breaking news, around when that needs to happen. And the skill sets are so vastly different between, commissioners of content, acquirers of content, and news leaders. And so I don't think that's going to be easy to execute at all. I know there's disquiet amongst the newsroom within TVNZ, understandably so. And until such time as it can be painted a picture of exactly how that's going to work and how that, in particular, that independence is going to be protected, I think that disquiet will remain.
I guess the part of the reason that this is complicated is that, historically, in terms of the 6 p.m. news on a linear context is where it's still one of the, and in many weeks it is the highest rating show in the country. But more than that, it is where the evening starts. So you have a big bomb of audience and you try and hold on to them as tight as possible for as long as possible. Every so often, like a country calendar will outrate the news, but for the most part, the shows that come after it are a process of giving away as little of the audience that you got at 6 p.m. as possible. And and as a result, even if news costs more, than the advertising you can sell against it at 6 p.m. and in other formats, because it starts off the night, everything else sort of benefits from that long tail of audience. So that's why I think news would and has a strong argument in saying we set up the night. The issue with the fusing of it with content is, as you move into a digital context, it doesn't have that same function, as far as I'm aware.
Although perhaps it should, and I think that's one of the key questions for me when you move into a digital world. If I think about the task ahead of that programming team and that content team, with a paywall potentially coming, and we'll come back and talk about that, but they have an enormous job to grow audience and eyeballs and time spent on TVNZ Plus on the entertainment front. On the news front, news as it currently stands, so the linear news that is replayed on, or played live on TVNZ Plus, is probably in the top 5 programming every week. But the future of news requires a lot of trial, a lot of innovation, and a lot of different ways of producing news. And that's just an extraordinary task to think that one person could be leading all of that versus actually having bespoke leadership, working in tandem, of course, amongst the leadership team. But the scale of the task here is pretty big.
So, I mean, there's a few different elements that we sort of want to discuss that kind of flow out of it. Firstly, actually, I mean, what is your sense of that idea to drop the onenews.co.nz slide? So I saw today, for example, that they have been pushing the fact that an early result of their One News Kantar poll that flags for the audience that they have a new poll that was in market that is launching at 6 p.m. tonight. That's a very clear example of how your website can trail what is coming at 6 p.m., i.e. play an audience building function for the 6 p.m. bulletin or for other sort of news pieces. Do you see the sort of the argument? Like I've personally written in favour of its closure on the basis of TVNZ is largely number one everywhere it goes, and it's a long way back here, and it doesn't have a good reason to think it can catch up to the leaders and stuff in the Herald.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to TVNZ's core purpose right now. Under the TVNZ Act, it's a commercial entity and needs to get commercial returns. And the bigger driver of 6 p.m. audience is actually going to be breakfast in the morning. That will push audience through to 6 p.m. In a much more meaningful way, I suspect, than One News. And ultimately, I think there are two issues here. One, the revenue returns against One News probably didn't match the cost, and even though they were often would get to number 3 or number 4 by Nielsen rankings in terms of news outlets, their revenues were some way behind, 1 and 2, without a clear pathway to how to grow that. The second issue being that from a workflow point of view inside that newsroom, it wasn't really a unified operation. You had teams running One News and you had teams running broadcast. And it's very difficult to make those two things work together. And I think I've said on this pod before, I think where TVNZ need to be is focusing on their core strength, which is video, and how do they move that into the future, which is not going to be without its challenges, of course. There's some things that they will need to make sure that they execute well, including the discoverability and searchability of video content in a TVNZ Plus environment.
So there's a few different ways we can go from here. I wonder if the first one, before we get to a sort of a fairly radical and challenging idea, let's talk a bit about that sort of workflow piece. Like, how do you TVN, the 6 p.m. bulletin, because it is so important from a revenue and ratings perspective, has always been this. It's been very stubborn to kind of try and move away from the kind of level of resourcing that it currently commands. And that's, in part, if you're talking to some of the people who worked on the likes of Sunday, that they felt to an extent that they were put up for sort of sacrifice because that core 6 p.m. product was seen as its demands were seen as kind of paramount over everything else. How would you, if you were trying to sort of recreate news in a way that serviced TVNZ Plus, in an ongoing way, in a similar way to what the way that the newsroom has historically serviced 6 p.m. What are the kind of things you do?
Well, the big thing is the rostering. I think there was a nod to that in some of their changes. The rostering of a newsroom, particularly in a broadcaster, is all geared towards that 6 p.m. product. In a TVNZ Plus world, it should be more of a 24/7 type thinking, that as the news comes out, you are live or you're with the audience in any way. So the rostering approach has to change. Also, you need a more agile production environment where you can go live at a moment's notice. So if you look around the world, a lot of breaking news events, they're done live from within the newsroom, not within the studio. Or there's a lot of curation in green screen, a lot cheaper production environments, green screen studios, where those studios have far more utility to make more product more often with more talent. And so there's a lot of test and trialing will need to be done. Also, I think that the utility of talent will need to kind of widen, have more breadth to it in terms of what they're doing. The talent will need to think, really hard about their social presence and how they leverage that more and more to bring audience back into TVNZ Plus. And frankly, they're going to have to do more than just be talking heads at a camera around that bulletin to really engage consumers and bring them in to the TVNZ Plus environment.
The sort of big option that hasn't really been, it's been nodded at a bit. There's this the idea that RNZ will move into the TVNZ building, the Auckland bureau, and they'll be co-located both from a revenue saving perspective for TVNZ. They'll pay less rent, or they'll get a rent contribution because they own the building, and that RNZ won't have to rent its building. And I think, I can't remember whether it sold it or not, but either way, there are savings there, but it also sort of naturally pushes them towards collaborating more. One of the options that's out there that would be a sort of scary thing for both newsrooms in a way, but also makes sense in some respects, is the idea of potentially merging the newsrooms to try and service that kind of that future that you just sketched out. Do you see an argument for that, or a likelihood that they head in that direction? There's a world where where TVNZ can make a contribution to RNZ and sort of vice versa in terms of creating a public media product that TVNZ can monetize aspects of it on their services, which will help defend the overall financial status of news within the organisation, but that RNZ gets the benefit of all that video experience and can create more products. What do you think the likelihood of that path being taken is?
I think it's inevitable. I think likely in the current government and its approach to public media may take some time to get there. But there's a couple of things that I think, I guess on the argument of inevitability, kind of get to that point. So one, TVNZ have made a very, it's a really big transformation, right, that they've announced last week. And clearly on the path to the 30 million, we haven't seen the breakdown, but clearly it's going to get there. But that doesn't address the challenges in the market and the cost of operating a newsroom, test and trial, all the things they need to do next year, the year after, and those economic pressures, I think, are still going to be there around running a newsroom as they are, around the world. So that alone creates this kind of rethink around what do we do. The other issue is that TVNZ, under the current Act, as I said before, are a wholly commercial entity. And at the moment, they are very, very, very exposed to the advertising market, notwithstanding a paywall strategy coming in. As that advertising market shrinks in their domain, that puts more pressure on the cost of the newsroom, and inevitably we see a risk to journalism. So I see a merger of the newsrooms being a place where the government can have a really strong public media strategy of delivery of news and current affairs content where it can be enshrined, it can protect journalism. And as you point out, TVNZ can still extract commercial value for their strategy out of that combined newsroom. It doesn't go as far as the ANZ-PM merger before, but it locks in those pieces that are pretty critical to a democracy. And it also means that TVNZ don't carry the kind of added cost and weight of trying to deliver to all of New Zealand. There's a supporting mechanism there for them to do that.
Yeah, I know that it's a big and somewhat scary idea, but I think it's instructive that TVNZ and RNZ are typically 1 and 2 in terms of trusted news sources. From a style perspective, there is generally a greater degree of sobriety in their approach. And so they're probably more aligned as far as ways to deliver, in terms of the style and the form of news than many other newsrooms in the country.
And the talent. There is a lot of RNZ talent that has come out of either News Hub or TVNZ where they have, skills across, both platforms. That's
very true. And you've got people who were made at RNZ now in key roles at TVNZ and vice versa. So there is a lot of people who, even though TVNZ's a commercial organisation, they still view it through that this is the national broadcaster, this is this is public media fundamentally. And that's another way, in some respects, if you did kind of create a more merged, even if it wasn't a wholly merged newsroom, that in some ways will protect both the scale and you can make a greater argument for not putting news into content and saying this is a separate part of what we're doing here. I don't think that's likely to happen, imminently, but it does feel like something that will get a really hard look before the end of the decade at least.
There's a lot of things, Duncan, that would need to change, obviously, to make that happen around the TVNZ Act and other kind of legislation around RNZ and TVNZ for that to happen. We know that takes time, and I suspect at the moment the government's approach is I'm not going to say minimalist intervention, but they certainly don't want to be pouring sort of taxpayer funds into anything right now, given the challenges in the broader economy. So whilst I think it's inevitable, I think there is some way to go to get there.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, senior writer at The Spin-Off. Next week, we'll be counting down the top 100 New Zealand television shows of the 21st century. But to celebrate the shows that were disqualified, forgotten, or just too weird, join me, Kura Forrester, Rhiannon McCall, and fellow Spin-Off writers live on stage at Q Theatre on October 31st. Prepare for a night of hot takes and cursed clips as we unearth television treasures and argue for their place in our history books. Tickets are on sale now at thespinoff.co.nz/events.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
One thing that's quite interesting and kind of sits right alongside all this is the reason that all this is happening right now is because TVNZ is looking to try and find $30 million in savings or new revenue, but let's be honest, it's more likely to be savings than new revenue at the moment. And that, which is quite shocking in some respects, because it's only a couple of years removed from an unexpectedly buoyant ad market and this sort of sense that, maybe things aren't so bad as they seemed, and TV retains this power. Yes, its ratings have declined on linear, but it feels like it's been hit harder by the sort of moribund ad market than you might necessarily have expected. And the thing that's interesting, I'd love your perspective on, is do you feel like this is, because everyone in media is suffering. I had coffee with someone this morning, runs a small media operation that was a really, really clever company. He's just battling in this market. And I haven't spoken to anyone in the last few months who hasn't just talked about just how difficult that ad market is. The thing that everyone's kind of waiting on is, yes, as we get these, we got a 50 basis point reduction in interest rates last week. We'd love to think that will continue and that will kind of revive what has been a really, really tough economy. When that happens, will we get back to sort of situation normal and, TV and all of the other associated quote unquote legacy media getting an uplift, or will we find that actually the returns continue to go disproportionately to global tech platforms and that local just isn't going to get back to where it was?
The multi-$100 million question, and so much rides on that question. I think let's just look at the things that are true. The systemic pressures on broadcasters, on media, are not changing. Fragmentation of audiences into new sources, whether that be news or entertainment, that continues. So those trends continue, and they actually put their own, no matter the size and state of the market, they put their own pressures on revenue monetization for the players. Over the last couple of years, and I asked a couple of colleagues this, or ex-colleagues in the industry, particularly on the buying side, what have they been doing in the last couple of years? So as the market has got smaller and that fragmentation has continued, have they been looking to find reach and other things elsewhere? And do they think that behaviour will shift back to local, or should the market change? And the answer was uniformly no. The behaviours that have been created over the last couple of years will remain into the future. And so that, and by the way, we talk about local media, but we've got to put it in the context of the overall marketplace of inventory that's being traded in New Zealand. There has never been more inventory. There is more and more video inventory. That market is actually growing in New Zealand. It's just that the share of local media's part of that is actually decreasing. And the more inventory that comes in the market, the more downward pressure on pricing, which makes it even harder, for example, for like the TVNZ transition from linear to digital when there's price pressure on CPM. So, look, I can't predict exactly what's going to happen. as I said, the structural changes remain, or the structural trends, I should say, remain. And that pressure on revenue, I think, is going to be there into the future. And dare I say it, we don't want our local media fighting each other for that. We ideally want, to have a more balanced marketplace where, they are sharing the returns, where the, international players are taking the majority of dollars offshore right now.
Yeah, I hate to say it because I think everyone is sort of holding out hope. And I do think that there's always going to be some relationship between the sort of broader economy and the advertising market, and that level of profound depression that sits over it right now. That if the economy roars back, media will benefit from that. It's just, will it return to the sort of level and the kind of equilibrium we saw prior? As you said, I agree that it's unlikely to.
Well, you had you did a brilliant pod recently with James Herman, and a lot of respect for James, and he is a big advocate for brand and the importance of brand and the ROI through brand advertising on television in particular. And I agree with all of that, arguing that for years and years and years and years. The challenge, though, over the last couple of years is marketing has become a victim of a procurement function within advertisers. Budgets have been cut, and they find ways to get ROI. And as those new behaviours are built, it's hard to go back to the old ways. And I think that's fundamentally what's ahead for the industry, is how do they convince everyone to come back. Don't get me wrong, stabilisation is going to be very, very important. Even if the revenue stabilise, that's going to be a great thing.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? On that sort of brand piece, you do see like there is a fundamental difference between the kind of exposure you get on a connected television, if you're being served a full-length advertisement, versus a 6-second pre-roll on a fold. Those aren't like for like; they are weighed differently. There are improvements which can be made in terms of the sort of volume and quality of ad and the amount of data that you can get back that TVNZ has in front of it that will hopefully increase the revenue it can get from that. But just fundamentally, your point earlier, I think, is just always the most salient one in digital media context, is that the amount of inventory itself is it's enormous, and it's very hard to kind of and growing all the time, and it's hard to get back to what used to drive the revenue, the profitability, the sort of market confidence of TVNZ, which was an enormous amount of constrained inventory, and if not a monopoly, then a huge share of the total audience market.
Well, I think that leads into a conversation around the benchmark for TVNZ Plus in a new world is going to be YouTube. And the ability to maintain tech user experience and ROI, they're going to be measured in that world against YouTube.
Well, it's interesting, right? Like, I sort of go back and forth on that, because YouTube, obviously from a user experience, from a total volume of content, and from content which self-evidently is what people want, even if it doesn't have the same kind of prestige production values a lot of the time, but not all the time, that television has. It also just serves you ads in a different way. But increasingly, I think now that they have just captured so much of audience behavior, where it used to be there'd be a single pre-roll, now there's 1, 2, sometimes 3. Where it used to be, you'd get the skip button after 3 or 5 seconds. Now they're showing you more of the ad. Now they're starting to put more breaks in the middle of ads, and a ever larger share of viewing is going to connected televisions, and this is obviously a global phenomenon. So, that you're right. That is where the sort of true challenge is coming from, and the more like television they can make it in terms of how it's viewed and how they serve ads, the harder it is for TVNZ, which pays for content rather than sharing revenue with creators, the harder it's going to be there.
Yeah.
One thing before we close is, just in terms of that, how legacy media makes its money piece. This is I have to declare a conflict here, because This technology I'm talking about was built by Daylight, which is the sort of sister creative and digital agency of the spin-off. But I do think it's interesting and instructive about what a sort of a path for monetization might be, particularly for news websites and a differentiator for New Zealand media. So last Tuesday, I went to the launch of a new, I guess it's a sort of a sub-brand that has been launched on the Stuff platform. It's in association with ANZ, so the biggest bank in the country, and it's basically a platform to allow small business owners, operators, and those who aspire to it to interact with other small business owners, with people who've really made it in that sector, with staff journalists. It's a big bomb of resource and has a bunch of kind of live functionality as well. And it's funded by the bank, and it's because they want to be associated with small businesses, be the bank that you go to when you're getting if you're starting one, all that sort of thing. Just marketing 101. But what's interesting about it to me is the fact that it takes advantage of some of the fundamental dynamic realities of the fundamental format. When you go to Stuff, you are interacting with that website, and that's different from what happens when you're watching a show on Netflix or TVNZ Plus, for that matter. You're used to going to the site, clicking, navigating around it through clicks. You're used to participating in quizzes and in polls and commenting. So that is kind of a baked-in audience behavior. Still, a large share of the viewing, and particularly the interaction, happens on desktop and laptop, and while you're at work. And so, I think about how the advertising side of the digital news business it's not particularly well developed. We sort of force autoplay videos. We run some display advertising, the quality of which can vary wildly. And there isn't really a strong known belief that there is, something bigger than that. And How To was quite a substantial project. They had ANZ speaking there. Sinead Boucher herself hosted a sort of a kind of a it was a kind of a chat show type format with Lisa King and Letitia Huff and Paddy Gower, a very, very new small business owner. But, you had these three operators talking about their businesses. And, the idea is, the theory of it is that you can take the fact that people are comfortable with interactivity and that you still have across the whole of the day on news websites, massive audiences, and you can fuse the sort of audience behavior with the scale of the audience, with the needs of the brand, into a new thing that is not like a TVC and can ultimately generate leads and awareness for a brand that is a different form to display advertising or the sort of new generation of TVCs that we see on TVNZ Plus and on YouTube.
I think it's incredibly instructive that the future is, this has been talked about for years, but what you're talking about now is bringing this to life, is this kind of multi-channel marketing approach where a single idea can originate leveraging someone else's audience, and then, create utility, for that brand, in this case, ANZ. Look, I think that it's fascinating. It's a brilliant, if you haven't seen it, please go check it out when it launches today.
It's launched today, yeah.
Today, yeah. Please go check it out. Be interested to get some feedback from our audience actually on what they think. But it is quite unique. It is carving new ground in the New Zealand market. Ultimately, it'll be interesting. The ultimate test of it is going to be how many people do interact with this, and does it create an ROI just like a TVC does? So, these are going to be the big questions around, can these new strategies work?
Absolutely. I think, and that's absolutely the core of it. This is a thesis that is being tested, that by building something new, that combination of sort of design, craft, creativity, and technology that Daylight sell, that news media websites here and overseas, that there's something about that can connect, that can turn their audience into value for brands, because, as you say, more inventory coming from places with no cost of content is the world that we will know long into the future. That is a baked-in reality. So if you have a cost of content, you need to figure out a way to leverage something that is unique and different about your audience and what they might be willing to do. Otherwise, or be able to develop a really substantial revenue stream from the audience. And it's probably not or, it's probably and. But this is the future that we're sort of figuring out here. And so
the other interesting thing about it, Duncan, sorry, just to cut you off, is and look, I don't know the detail of this around the data sharing between Stuff and ANZ, but that data through this product and the ability to learn about audiences, and that then to be instructive and inform products and services from both Stuff and ANZ into the future is incredibly powerful. And I think that at the core of where these very strong relationships exist can deliver enormous value, outside of the product itself.
Yeah, no, ultimately, like that's the kind of thing that, you can't, when you're at YouTube scale, or any of the social platform scale, you can't build a specific piece of technology for a client and roll it out on your website. It's completely impossible. So you have to think about what are things that we can do at our scale that might provide true differentiation for audiences, but particularly for advertisers. So, as we're trying to figure out the future of TVNZ, and we'll go through and do a similar project on, all of the other scale players in this market over time. That's the big existential question we're asking about the future of this business. Thanks so much for coming on this week, Glenn, and talk to you very soon.
Thank you.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, Senior Writer at The Spin-Off. Next week, we'll be counting down the top 100 New Zealand television shows of the 21st century. But to celebrate the shows that were disqualified, forgotten, or just too weird, join me, Kura Forrester, Rhiannon McCall, and fellow Spin-Off writers live on stage at Q Theatre on October 31st. Prepare for a night of hot takes and cursed clips as we unearth television treasures and argue for their place in our history books. Tickets are on sale now at thespinoff.co.nz/events.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.